Hello, everybody, and welcome. I am so excited to have you all here today for our Project Motherhood Parenting Masterclass. If any of you do not know me, I am Allison Cooper, the founder of Project Motherhood, and today I am joined with Sarah Mayfield. She is a compassionate bereavement care certified provider, and she's the author of a really wonderful book, This Sure Thing. And we're going to talk about all of that and everything in between. So I'm going to hand it over to Sarah to introduce herself and share a little bit about what she does.
Thank you, Allison. Thanks so much for having me here today. It's a joy to be with you. I am based out of Richmond, Virginia, and I provide grief counseling to both youth and adults. I have a passion for both. And so some days I'm hopping in to a session with like a 5-year-old, and then I'm moving on to, a 60-something-year-old. So it keeps it interesting. I also do some group work as well. I volunteer through an organization called the Miss Foundation and provide a support group for grieving parents. So yeah, I'm busy, but it's all really, it's really meaningful work where you get to see some of like the coolest parts of the human spirit, right? That's kind of what the work week looks like, is individual counseling and then some group work. That's about it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that. I think that's incredible. And, grief comes in so many different forms, especially when you're raising kids, right? So I think it's such an important conversation to have. And I'm excited to learn some tips for, navigating all of that today. Yeah. So I'm going to jump into our list of questions.
Sounds great.
Okay. So first one, you are certified in compassionate bereavement care and I'm sorry if I butchered that. Thanatology.
Good job.
Can you share what those mean in simple terms for parents who may be new to grief work?
Sure. That word is hard, right? Yes. Thanatology.
No.
Or like thanatologist. That's even harder in my opinion. So the compassionate bereavement care certification is through the Miss Foundation. It's based out in Arizona, Cottonwood, and it was started by Dr. Cacciatore. She experienced the death of her daughter Cheyenne through stillbirth, and so she started this whole amazing nonprofit organization. And she has the first care farm in the United States where she rescues animals. And then she has multiple properties on her acreage. And so grievers are invited to come stay and receive counseling and just all sorts of different, healing kind of services.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. So anyway, the point is she offers different certifications and trainings as well throughout, the calendar year. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of the trainings I did. It was a 4-day training, and I went there, and it was just awesome. It's helpful on a professional level and then also on a personal level, with your sitting with your own grief as well.
Right.
So that's the compassionate bereavement care one. Thanatology, certification in thanatology, is through ADEC, which is the Association of Death Education and Counseling. Big name, right?
Yeah.
And so learning about all the theories in death, dying, and bereavement, the thing that most people don't really want to learn about too much. And so just learning about the theories and different studies and research, and then taking it was a pretty hard test. I'm going to give them that. So yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Thanks.
So many parents struggle with knowing what to say or not to say to a grieving child. What's one of the biggest misconceptions about how kids experience grief?
I think that's a great question. So I think one of the things I hear repeatedly from parents who have kids that they're bringing in, or youth or adolescents, is that it just looks different, right? So a lot of times we can overlook the fact that there is actually grief happening, because one minute the kid is, running around on the playground or texting with friends and like, sending all these crazy emojis or whatever.
Yeah.
And then the other moment, there might be this outburst or something of anger or of just crying. But then typically a couple minutes or an hour later, it's back to it, right?
Yeah.
So it tends to look a little more segmented or disjointed. Whereas when in adults, we kind of sit with something for a longer period. And that could be maybe due to attention span, right? Or cognitive development or any of these reasons. So I think the number one thing is it's easy, myself included, to look at a kid who's grieving and think, oh, it must not be that difficult or there's not as much pain. But when you actually start asking the questions and meeting them where they are, that's when you can kind of see, it's reaffirming to see that, no, there is a lot of grief there and a lot of pain. So I think the first thing is assuming, because grief looks different, assuming that it's not as heavy or pronounced or deep or painful. That's a big one. And then also putting our own timetable kind of on what we expect, right? And the heavy grief might take longer to present. We might not see it right away. It might be a little, I don't know if I like the word delayed, but it could take a little bit of time to sink in, right? The shock and the awareness that it's there. It might take a little bit longer. So there might not be huge things you're seeing right at first.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Well, then I guess, you sort of touched on this a little bit, but how does grief show up differently and what should we look for that as, at different ages? We're looking at a toddler, we're looking at a teen.
Yeah.
What does it typically look like?
So I think, developmental milestones and all that good stuff. When we think about young kids, like preschool age, death is kind of an elusive topic, right? We often hear it's just a hard construct to grasp. It may not seem permanent. So often reestablishing that the person is gone, they are dead, which is hard language to use, right?
Yeah.
But it's necessary. And oftentimes we readdress it because there's sometimes the lack of permanency or the hope that the person really will come back, right? And then as you get older, it's kind of interesting, right?
Yeah.
It's grasped, the finality is grasped more, right? Once again, not assuming because it looks different that they're not grieving. That kind of plays into the upper elementary, middle school years.
Yeah.
And then when you get to the teen years, it's this interesting thing that happens where a grieving teen is struggling for independence, right? It's a logical thing that happens around that time, pulling away a bit. But when a traumatic or significant loss occurs, it usually flips that upside down. And then all of a sudden the teen is kind of needing those supports that they were trying to pull away from. And so it can be kind of an unsettling experience in addition to the grief for the teen, needing those parents that they were trying to distance a little bit from. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, this is a question that's not on my list, but it just popped into my head.
Great, I love that. I'm
going off script here. So there are so many different types of grief, and I feel like, kids and teens, they have really big emotions, and there's a lot of things that they, might consider, grief or something that they're struggling with. Do we handle all types of grief the same way? Or is it? Yeah,
that's a good question. So I think typically, that word thanatology is specific to the lane of death, right? Death, dying, and bereavement. But I think what you're talking about are what we would put in the category of like a living loss, something that you're experiencing, that's not a death loss.
Absolutely.
And there are for sure similar themes, similar emotions, things like that can often overlap between the two. But we in the death field do like to say that is a distinct experience, especially being that there's finality, right? And then a lot of times what we see is there's a trauma element sometimes to it as well. And there can be with living losses as well. But we do like to kind of keep them a little bit distinct, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's move on and talk about your beautiful book.
Oh, thanks. Yeah.
What inspired the story and what message did you hope to give families through it?
Oh, thanks. So the joke is, at least for myself, I never was able to journal. Everybody be like, journal. So my let me go back to that. I guess I shouldn't start with the joke when I'm going to talk about a sad story, but my son Elliot died at 1.5 years suddenly and unexpectedly. He died in his sleep, and I found him. Yeah, thank you. At 6 a.m. Those are timestamps, so you can just visualize it, right? And so grieving as an adult, grieving the death of your child is insert word here. I don't know what the word is, right? But then watching, I had a son who was almost 4 at the time, and watching my 4-year-old son grieve his brother. I like to say it was like a certain kind of, it was kind of torture, because you're grieving your loss, but then you're also having to watch your living kid grieve. And so that's just incredibly painful. And so I think I never was able to journal, coming back to that. It would always be recommended in like support groups or with one-on-one therapy or whatever. And I just couldn't bring myself to write. I didn't have an interest in it. I think I had some pressure on myself that whatever I would write about, how could that express the magnitude of this loss?
Yeah.
How could I do honor to my son who's died? It just felt too overwhelming to me, so I could never really do it. And then, lo and behold, right, January of, I don't know, January of 2020 something. I think 2022, yeah. Something just kind of came over me, and I had this intense desire to write something, and it was about the way, from my living son's perspective, how the relationship would have looked if he and his brother had grown up together. And then also the things he does living his life without his brother that kind of honor and bring memory to him. And so I it's interesting how healing works, right? It was like this thing that needed to come out of me, that I needed to address, that was maybe the most hurtful thing, not seeing them grow up together, right?
Yeah.
Those dreams you have about seeing these 2 kids 2 years apart, forever be siblings. And so I think the writing this down and working on this process, and then having an illustrator put pictures, hand-drawn, beautiful pictures to just the words, definitely took something way in here and put it out. That's the personal aspect of it. Then there's the professional aspect, where I see that whole, kids are young, they'll be okay, or it doesn't really look like he's grieving, that kind of thing, or just the comments I heard and that I see. And I don't want to be harsh. It's well-intentioned. People want desperately for kids to be okay. It's hard to see pain, right?
Yeah.
But I'm very much an advocate, and my background is in school counseling too. So that's 9 years as an elementary school counselor. So I have a passion for kiddos. And so the book is also a way of showing kids it's okay to grieve. What the grief looks like, that's you, right? And then here are ways to stay connected, kind of, and honor your loved one even after death, because a lot of times society moves on, right? Other people move on, and the pressure can be to kind of take the pictures. Take the pictures down, move on, and there's still this, usually a big love that is still there. And so what do we do with that? And so that's kind of what the book scratches on, is what we call continuing bonds. It's a theory, a grief theory, of what you do with the love that you still have.
I love that. I love that. I am sure that this book has helped so many people go, grieve and go through this process. It's especially for kids.
Yeah, thank you. That's the hope, right?
Right, because I'm sure that there are so many books that are written for adults, all the self-help books that go deep, and this is the work you should be doing, but what's really there for kids?
Yeah. And great point. And I see sometimes siblings, especially, as the kind of forgotten griever, just because of the nature of the setup. The parents, who are usually shell shocked and just right
Right.
receive the focus, which is not a bad thing. But then a lot of times the sibling who's still there as well and grieving
Yeah.
doesn't receive as much attention or as much support potentially.
Mhm.
And so I see that also this is kind of a book for that overlooked demographic.
Love that. So when a child loses a sibling, how can parents help them grieve without pushing their own grief aside? Is it okay for kids to see us cry?
Yeah, that's a great question. 100%, because when you're grieving, an adult is grieving in front of their child is grieving, you're modeling for them
Yep.
how to grieve. One, how it could look, right? It doesn't have to always look that way. And the kid is noticing everything. I mean, I have kids that come in and say, I don't want to talk about it with my mom because I'm worried she's going to get sad too, which is fair, right?
Yeah, that's so fair. And that's a really, that didn't even cross my mind.
Yeah,
But
there's a lot of complex kind of dynamics, especially.
Yeah.
And I think the number one thing is just talk about it. Like call it out, talk about it. And there's no right or wrong to grieving, right? I think we need to normalize being better about just talking about grief. And it's okay to be in pain. It doesn't feel great.
Right.
It doesn't feel great to be grieving, but it's actually healthy and expected. So with that said, I think the parent modeling and being realistic and saying, no, mommy's sad because this happened. And, just being real about it.
Yeah.
Kids are, we don't give them credit a lot of times.
True. It's true. They're very intuitive. They're very, they notice.
No. So if you are trying to hold back and you're, they know that too. Right.
Yeah.
So I think it's just always better to be real.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
Yeah.
So what are some gentle ways that parents can start a conversation about death or loss with younger children, even before they maybe have experienced it firsthand? Because we know those questions come up. Maybe they, a friend at school is experiencing it. They haven't experienced it yet. You get so many questions as a parent.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Right. So I think for just an introduction, assuming it's just questions coming from your kid who maybe doesn't have something around them that they're noticing. They're just questions coming up. I often like to go towards nature to kind of point out stuff, right? Because you can look around, like this time of year, I'm looking out my window right now. You can look around and talk about just what we know about life, right?
Yeah.
The butterfly or the birds or whatever, and just the cycle of life and just kind of normalizing it. This is the way it is, right? Once again, as a parent, you're modeling. And so if we make it big, bad, and scary, it's going to feel that way. If we make it kind of matter of fact and talk about this is kind of how it happens, we all have a life that we live, right? And then everyone at some point will die. Let's live that life, right? It's in how we present it, right?
Yeah.
But normalizing it, I think, and just making it okay to talk about is 100% key.
That's great, great, great advice. Are there phrases or go-to responses that you recommend avoiding when comforting a grieving child, or what could be said and instead of those?
Oh, there's so many, and we have time for this. Okay, but it's also not just for kids, for any people that are grieving, right?
Yeah.
Typically the impulse to fix it or to make it better or to take the pain away. Nah, don't go there. And I get it. It's, oh my gosh. I can remember my 4-year-old looking out the window the day Elliot died, actually. And he's usually boisterous, crazy, loud. I would like him to be quieter, right? And this time he's sitting there absolutely quiet looking out the window. And it took everything in my being to not step on that moment or intrude on that moment and say something. I just had to let him look out the window because he needs to have his time. You know what I mean? Without me. Yeah. And there's times later that we could talk about it, but he was obviously doing some processing in that moment, right? and I could have trampled all over it, and with my impulse to try to fix it or make it better.
Yeah.
It's necessary to feel the pain. It's necessary to sit with the grief. When we remind ourselves of that, it helps us kind of respect it more and honor it, as opposed to trying to qualify it or make it better.
Mm-hmm.
Lingo is really important, especially with younger kids. So saying, someone passed away, or, just passive euphemisms. Even some people have said, like, literally, I've heard somebody went to the beach. No, they died. Why are we saying they went to the beach? We're just messing with a kid's processing.
Yeah.
That's an extreme example, but being direct and using the word, even though it's hard, died and death, because it needs to be concrete and it needs to not be figurative language, because those do not make sense, especially to our young kids. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Random thought just popped into my head, because I'm
with it. Let's go.
So much you're opening my eyes to, but my daughter, who's 8, like, we've never really had like this big conversation with her about death, and she worked on something in school recently, and it was like she had to like write out her kind of like what she wanted to do with her life, like some of the things. And then she ended it with like, and then I die. and I was just like, oh, and I was, well, this is just a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago. And I was just like, oh my, like, it took me by surprise, but they really do. It just shows how much kids learn on their own, number one, and just pick up on things. So having these big conversations are so important. Yeah.
And I love the fact that, like, I'm assuming here, just based on the way you said it, that it was matter of fact for her.
It was matter of fact. She's going to go to Paris, become a teacher, and then she's going to die. It's like, okay.
and credits.
and yeah.
Yes. So that's my point. I think kids get it when we're direct with them, and they, and I think it's as we get older in society that kind of messes with it a bit and says, no, we're not allowed to talk about that stuff, or it's not acceptable, or it's not okay. And it has mainly to do with our discomfort.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So maybe we have a future thanatologist right there.
You never know. She is very assertive. Like, it's just like, this is how it is. Okay.
I like that. Go ahead.
She gets it from my husband, not me.
I was going to say.
He's very direct, and I need to learn to be more like that. I'm the wishy-washy, like,
that's hilarious.
Emotion. One. Okay, anyways, back to our questions. How can parents support their kids through a sudden loss, like the death of a pet, friend, or relative, especially when they don't fully understand it yet?
Yeah. So every loss is different, right?
Yeah.
Let's just say that up front. Sudden and unexpected loss has a different element into it, in that there's going to be, there's shock regardless, but there's going to be obviously a level of shock there.
Yeah.
And so the awareness that this is real, that this is irreversible, that this is here to stay, takes a good amount of work and time to sit with. Sometimes also we see heightened anxiety with sudden and unexpected loss, because it's like the rug has been ripped out from under you and you didn't see that coming.
Yeah.
So then it's kind of like there's hypervigilance, right? What else could happen, right? It's that feeling of what I expected, or how the world looked, or how I thought this person would be with me forever is not. So it's just boom, right? So remind me of the question.
How can parents support their kids through sudden loss?
Yeah. Patience. This is a huge one. Patience, because there's going to be repeated processing, just with any loss, but especially with sudden and unexpected, because it's like, what happened? How did this happen? Right?
Yeah.
You're getting your bearings. And so repeat questions will occur over and over and over again. And it can be exhausting as a parent, right?
Yeah.
And even a little bit annoying, I'm going to be honest with you. But it is part of the cognitive process of assimilating kind of the loss and letting the reality of it sink in.
Yeah.
So to me, patience is the number one thing. But then, of course, the flip side of that is listening, and listening with the intent of not answering, and listening with the intent of not fixing, like just listening. And so when someone says, how could this happen? Like a kid, this is weird. Didn't see this happening. Just reflecting that and saying, you didn't see this coming. This,
Yeah.
like just as simple as that. Think about it. When somebody sees how you're really feeling and they say that back to you, it's like, right? Somebody listened and they reaffirmed. So patience and listening. It sounds simple, but that's really, and then reassurance that like, I'm here with you now. I love you. Right? That's something that is a constant right now.
Yeah. Now, another thing that's popping in my head, especially in a situation where there is, sudden loss, but I mean, in all situations of death, when is the point where you say, okay, we should go see a counselor or a therapist, where it's just, parents can just kind of tell that what they're doing at home is just not enough?
Sure. Yeah. I'm biased, being that that's what I do.
Yeah.
So I would argue that I see a range of presentations. I think there's some people who come and they want to have an opportunity to talk about their person, right? Because of that whole, maybe other people are not as comfortable sitting with the pain. And so I'm someone who can offer that, right? Then there's other people who maybe it's a conflicted relationship. There's elements of trauma. It's like there's some stacking. So there's some complicated factors there.
Yeah.
And so they come in to kind of work on that. I would argue, especially if the parent is impacted by grief as well, the same loss, right? Yeah. It's often beneficial to have an impartial, objective person who I'm not grieving that loss. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
I mean, yes, I'm touched by it and I'm heartbroken for the person, but I am able to be an impartial support that's not going to react as a parent who is grieving that loss as well. So my argument is, and let's be real, like if a kid's coming into therapy, you got to kind of make it fun.
Yeah.
Because 9 out of 10 times they're not choosing to be there themselves.
Yeah.
So you got to kind of win them over. So there's always like a game element, like creative arts element. There's also the processing, which is the heavy stuff. But then because kids and youth grieve more segmented, you sit with it for a hot second, but then you're going to do something else. So I would argue it's, once again, biased. It's always a beneficial outlet for processing.
Yeah, absolutely. So in these situations where, parent and child, they're all experiencing the same loss together, what, I guess I don't want to say should it look like to grieve as a family, but what are, some ways that that can look like?
Yeah.
Grieve together in a healthy way.
Yeah. The first thing that pops into my mind is just people have different styles of grieving. So just off the cuff, in general, there's Ken Doka, being a thanatologist, I'm going to cite some stuff here.
Yeah.
And Terry Martin came up with some styles of grieving, and they put it into 2 main buckets, one being instrumental and one being intuitive. And the intuitive grievers are kind of the ones that wear like the emotions on the sleeve. They're more emotive, right? So maybe more outwardly crying, processing through feelings and emotions. Then the instrumental griever is like the doing things, maybe not crying outwardly, but processing by doing and being active and that kind of stuff. But then of course there's like a blended, which is like a little bit of both, which most people probably are. But so I leaned towards the instrumental, which, big generalization here, tends to not be how most women lean. Tends to be more emotion forward, and support groups at least, right? And then my husband tended to lean more with the emotive style. So we were complete opposites. And so sometimes I would be planning the funeral or doing stuff and I would be like this, right? Like get to it. And then he would be crying. And so like that can kind of, right? Or I would start crying on my own. It's like, so we were just, so patience and recognizing that everyone grieves differently, even if it is the same person. And I also love the idea of like ritual for families. So having things to outwardly do to process the loss, whether that be we painted like a canvas, each of us added to it, in memory of Elliot. And so that's hanging kind of in a part of our house.
Yeah.
We've taken on like a park to kind of steward in Elliot's name. So like having specific things as something popped up, as a family unit to do, right?
Mhm.
And how each individual person joins that or participates in that might look different.
Yeah.
But I just think it's good to kind of create those opportunities that that family members can join in, to actively kind of grieve together.
I love that. That's really, really great advice. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to ask one last thing, and it's always like, what is the one thing that you want parents watching to take away if they're going, if they're managing grief right now? What's something, that you're like, this is the thing?
This is the thing? Okay. That overall, like, I'm going to get real here.
Let's get real.
Get real. Western society has a discomfort with pain and grief. And so sometimes the messages that we can get when we're grieving is that we should be over it, or that it should be better by now, or that it's been blank number of years. Why aren't you better? And so in reality, especially with a significant loss, grief goes on forever. It just morphs and changes. The way it looks is different for everybody, and it morphs and changes. There's no specific timetable for this stuff. And so we can't expect that for children who are going through all these developmental changes as well, right?
Yeah.
So we need to be open-minded with that, and that grief morphs and it changes, and it certainly will with a child growing up. But not to happiness watch it, but the flip side of the grief, the grief that lasts that long is usually because the love was so big.
That's big. Yeah, I like that. Ooh.
Yeah.
That's really, really a really good reminder. I think I never thought of flipping it like that.
There you go.
You're good. I love it.
God.
I love it. Well, thank you again so much for being here today. Everybody, the email that this video is in that you're getting today, make sure you check that, because I have a link to Sarah's website and where you can purchase her book and all that good stuff. Follow her on all the platforms.
All the things.
Yes, all the things. So yes, thank you again so much. Thank you everybody for tuning in today. And until next time, bye.